Behind the thick walls of the Vatican lie documents that could turn our understanding of world history upside down. 85 kilometers of archives contain not only religious texts, but also secret agreements with dictators, financial schemes with the mafia, and diplomatic intrigues that lasted for centuries. From deals with Mussolini to silence during the Holocaust. From the escape of Nazis through monasteries to money laundering through church banks. The Holy See has always been not only a spiritual center, but also an influential political player. Today, we will reveal the darkest secrets of one of the world's oldest institutions and learn how religion became an instrument of power. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss new investigations into the mysteries of world history. And in the comments, discuss. Do you think Pope Pius XII's silence during the Holocaust was justified? Was it diplomatic wisdom or moral cowardice? Behind the massive walls of the Vatican, in the labyrinthine underground vaults, lie documents that could turn our understanding of world history upside down. 85 kilometers of shelves hold secrets accumulated over 2,000 years of the Catholic Church's existence. These archives contain not only religious texts and papal bulls, but also secret diplomatic correspondence, financial agreements, and minutes of meetings with the most odious figures of the 20th century. Until 1981, access to these materials was completely closed to researchers. Even after the partial opening of the archives, most of the most compromising documents remain classified. The Vatican Library resembles an iceberg, where the visible part is only a small fraction of what is hidden in the depths. Special repositories, accessible only to select cardinals, contain materials on deals with dictators, financial machinations, and political manipulations. Historians have been seeking permission for years to study documents from the World War II period, but the Vatican stubbornly denies them access. What exactly do these papers hide? What deals were made in the silence of the papal chambers? Why is the most powerful religious organization in the world so afraid of revealing the truth? Vatican archivists work under strict rules of secrecy, passing on their knowledge only to trusted successors. Each document undergoes thorough censorship before being approved for publication. The cataloging system is so complex that even an experienced researcher needs months to find the information they need. Many folders are marked with codes that cannot be deciphered without special keys. There is evidence that some particularly sensitive materials were destroyed at critical moments in history. However, copies of these documents surface in the most unexpected places, revealing to the world the truth about the Holy See's behind-the-scenes games. Former Vatican employees talk about secret departments where materials on living politicians and current heads of state are stored. These files are used in diplomatic negotiations as a tool for pressure and blackmail. Vatican intelligence gathers information through an extensive network of priests and bishops around the world. Confessionals become a source of the most intimate secrets of those in power. Papal nuncios in various countries serve not only as spiritual mentors, but also as secret agents of influence. They report to Rome on political sentiments, economic processes, and potential threats to the interests of the Church. Some documents that accidentally leaked to the press show the extent of the Vatican's awareness of world events long before their official development. The Church knew about impending wars, coups, and economic crises, but preferred to remain silent, using this information to strengthen its own position. What else do these archives hide? Vatican diplomacy is a unique system of international influence that has no parallel in the modern world. Unlike ordinary states, the Holy See has spiritual authority over 1 billion Catholics around the world, which gives it tools of influence that are unavailable to secular governments. The network of papal representations covers 180 countries, where nuncios enjoy diplomatic privileges and have direct access to heads of state. This system originated in the Middle Ages, when popes claimed supremacy over kings and emperors. Over time, the form has changed, but the essence has remained the same: to influence world politics through religious, economic, and diplomatic channels. The Vatican is an observer at the United Nations, which allows it to participate in discussions on global issues without a formal vote, but with enormous moral authority. Papal encyclicals often form the basis for international resolutions and political decisions. The Vatican's influence mechanism operates on several levels simultaneously. The first level is official diplomacy through nuncios and the Secretary of State. The second level is informal connections through Catholic organizations, orders, and charitable foundations. The third level is secret negotiations and backroom deals that the public never learns about. The Vatican uses its priests as agents of influence in a wide variety of fields. Catholic universities train the future elite of many countries. Church schools shape the worldview of millions of children. Hospitals and charitable organizations create networks of loyalty and dependence. Through the confessional system, the Church gains access to the most intimate information about politicians, businessmen, and military leaders. Confidentiality protects this information from disclosure, but not from use for diplomatic purposes. History knows many examples when information obtained in confession became the basis for political decisions of the Vatican. The Church's financial system is another instrument of influence. The Vatican Bank, officially called the Institute for Religious Works, controls billions of dollars in assets around the world. These funds are used not only to support religious activities, but also for political lobbying, financing friendly regimes, and countering unwelcome governments. Church investments in various sectors of the economy give the Vatican leverage over corporations and states. Secret funds allow it to finance operations that will never appear in official reports. Catholic orders such as the Jesuits, Opus Dei, and the Legionaries of Christ operate as autonomous structures with their own goals and methods. They infiltrate the educational systems, business communities, and political elites of various countries. The Jesuits traditionally specialize in education and intellectual influence. Opus Dei works with business and political circles. The Legionaries of Christ create media empires and control information flows. Each order has its own specific characteristics, but they all serve the common goal of strengthening the position of the Catholic Church in the world. Vatican intelligence, unofficially called the Holy Alliance, has existed since the 16th century. It gathers information through a global network of priests, monks, and lay people. Each diocese has its own informants. Every parish can become a collection point for intelligence data. The conspiracy system is so well established that most participants are not even aware of their role in it. They simply pass on interesting information to their bishop, who then reports it to Rome. But in reality, these seemingly innocent reports add up to a detailed picture of the political and economic situation in any country in the world. But what specific deals did the Vatican make with dictators? Concordats are international treaties between the Vatican and secular states that regulate the status of the Catholic Church in their territory. At first glance, these are ordinary diplomatic agreements on religious freedoms, education, and church property. However, behind the legal facade, there are often secret protocols and verbal agreements that are never published in official documents. The history of the 20th century knows many examples when the Vatican concluded concordats with openly dictatorial and totalitarian regimes. These deals provided the Church with a privileged position in exchange for tacit consent or even active support for repressive governments. The first high-profile example was the concordat with fascist Italy, but it was far from the last. The Vatican's list of partners includes the regimes of Salazar in Portugal, Franco in Spain, Pinochet in Chile, Vichy in France, and many others. Each such agreement strengthened the position of dictators and gave them religious legitimacy. In return, the Church gained control over education, financial privileges, and protection from anti-religious campaigns. The Vatican's logic was pragmatic. It was better to deal with a strong authoritarian ruler who protected the interests of the Church than to take a risk with a democratic government where the influence of religion could be limited. This position led the Church to turn a blind eye to mass repression, torture, and murder if the dictator guaranteed its privileges. During the Spanish Civil War, the Vatican openly supported Franco against the Republican government. The Church declared his uprising a crusade against atheists and communists. Priests blessed Franco's troops, and Pope Pius XI sent congratulatory telegrams on their victories. After Franco established his dictatorship, the Concordat of 1953 made Catholicism the only permitted religion in Spain. The Church gained complete control over education and censorship. Any criticism of the Church was equated with treason. The clergy received enormous financial privileges and tax exemptions. In Portugal, Salazar built his regime on the principles of Catholic corporatism. The Concordat of 1940 gave the Church unprecedented power over public life. Divorce was prohibited, civil marriages were not recognized, and abortion was punishable by imprisonment. The Church controlled all educational programs and censored the media. In exchange, the clergy actively supported Salazar's regime, calling it a model of Christian governance. Critics of the government were excommunicated from the Church, which in a deeply Catholic society meant social death. In Latin America, the Vatican signed concordats with numerous military juntas that came to power through coups. Argentina, Brazil, Chile, Colombia. In all these countries, the Church supported dictators in exchange for privileges. The case of Pinochet in Chile is particularly telling. After the bloody coup of 1973, which resulted in the deaths of thousands of people, the Church quickly recognized the new regime. Although individual priests and bishops criticized the repression, the Vatican's official position was one of cautious approval. The Concordat gave the Church the right to religious education in state schools and financial support from the state. The mechanism for concluding such agreements was perfected. First, the Vatican established informal contacts with the leaders of the new regime through its nuncios. This was followed by secret negotiations on mutual concessions. Once agreements were reached, an official concordat was signed, which was presented as a concern for the rights of believers. But the real terms of the deal remained behind the scenes. Critics accused the Vatican of trading moral principles for material gain. The Church, which should protect the oppressed, became an ally of the oppressors. But was Mussolini the first and last such ally? On February 11, 1929, an event took place at the Lateran Palace that changed the balance of power in Europe. Pope Pius XI and Benito Mussolini signed the Lateran Treaty, ending 60 years of conflict between the Vatican and the Italian state. Since 1870, when Italian troops captured Rome, the popes had considered themselves prisoners in their own palace. Mussolini proposed a solution that suited both sides: recognition of the Vatican's sovereignty and huge financial compensation in exchange for political support for the fascist regime. The Vatican received 750 million lira in cash and government bonds worth 1 billion lira, a colossal sum at the time. This wealth became the foundation of the modern power of the Vatican Bank. But the price of this deal turned out to be much higher than money. The Church effectively blessed the fascist dictatorship, calling Mussolini a man sent by Providence. Pius XI stated in his speech that the Duce had returned God to Italy and Italy to God. This phrase became the official propaganda mantra of the regime. The Catholic Church received the exclusive right to religious education in all schools in Italy. Catholicism was declared the only state religion. Marriages contracted in the Church were given civil force without additional registration. Criticism of the Church became a criminal offense. The fascist state took over the financing of the clergy and the maintenance of church buildings. In return, the Church pledged not to interfere in politics and to support Mussolini's regime. All bishops had to swear allegiance to the Italian state. Priests who criticized fascism were repressed with the tacit consent of the Vatican. Catholic organizations were either integrated into the fascist system or dissolved. The Catholic youth movement was absorbed by fascist structures. The secret part of the agreement included a commitment by the Church not to support the anti-fascist opposition and not to provide refuge to political refugees. The Vatican was to share intelligence information with the regime. In exchange, Mussolini guaranteed the inviolability of church property and the privileges of the clergy. This deal became a model for subsequent concordats with totalitarian regimes. Pius XI believed that authoritarian rule better protected the interests of the Church than democracy, with its unpredictability and secularism. Fascism seemed like a reliable defense against communism and liberalism, the two main enemies of the Church. Mussolini skillfully used religious legitimacy to strengthen his power. After the Concordat was signed, his popularity skyrocketed, even among those who had previously been skeptical of fascism. The Pope's blessing removed moral doubts for millions of Catholics. The Church actively participated in glorifying the regime. Priests held special services in honor of fascist holidays. Catholic newspapers printed laudatory articles about the Duce. Bishops called on believers to obey the fascist state as God's will. When Mussolini unleashed aggressive wars in Ethiopia and Spain, the Church did not condemn these actions. On the contrary, Italian bishops blessed the troops setting out to conquer foreign lands. The Pope remained silent, while fascist planes bombed the civilian population and used chemical weapons. Within the Vatican, there were priests and cardinals who criticized the alliance with fascism. But their voices were drowned out by official propaganda. Several courageous priests who openly opposed the regime were arrested with the tacit consent of the Church leadership. The Lateran Pacts are still in force today, albeit in a modified form. They still give the Catholic Church special status in Italy. But was the deal with Mussolini the Vatican's only compromise with totalitarianism? The Vatican's relationship with Nazi Germany is one of the darkest and most controversial episodes in the history of the Catholic Church. On July 20, 1933, just 6 months after Hitler came to power, the Vatican signed the Reich Concordat with the Third Reich. This treaty was the Nazi regime's first major international agreement and gave it legitimacy on the world stage. The Vatican's Secretary of State, Cardinal Eugenio Pacelli, the future Pope Pius XII, personally negotiated with Hitler's representatives. Officially, the Concordat was supposed to protect the rights of Catholics in Germany. But in fact, it became a deal with the devil. The Church received guarantees of the inviolability of its organizations and the right to religious education. In exchange, the Catholic clergy pledged not to participate in politics and not to criticize the Nazi regime. The Catholic Center Party, which could have opposed Hitler, dissolved itself immediately after the signing of the Concordat at the insistence of the Vatican. This removed the last serious obstacle to dictatorship. German bishops who had previously criticized Nazism changed their position dramatically. They called on believers to obey the new authorities and cooperate with the regime. Archbishop Konrad Grober of Freiburg even joined an organization supporting the NSDAP. Many priests became agents of the regime, informing on parishioners. The secret protocols of the Concordat were never published in full. Historians suggest that they contained the Vatican's commitments to cooperate with German intelligence and agree not to provide refuge to political refugees. There is evidence of secret financial agreements between the Vatican Bank and Nazi banks. Church accounts were used to launder looted property. After the start of mass repression against Jews, the Vatican maintained diplomatic relations with the Reich. Papal nuncios attended official ceremonies of the Nazi regime. Pius XI tried several times to criticize Nazism, but his encyclical With Deep Concern of 1937 was written in such vague terms that it had no practical effect. When the Pope died in 1939, there is a theory that he was preparing a stronger condemnation of racism and anti-Semitism, but death prevented him from doing so. His successor, Pius XII, chose a policy of silence. Vatican diplomats received detailed reports of Nazi atrocities from the very beginning of the war. Polish bishops reported mass murders. The Slovak nuncio reported on the deportation of Jews. German priests secretly passed on information about death camps. But the Pope preferred not to make public statements, citing the need to maintain neutrality and protect Catholics in occupied countries. Some researchers believe that Pius XII feared that open condemnation of Nazism would lead to even greater repression against the Church and believers. Others accuse him of anti-Semitism and sympathizing with fascism. The truth probably lies somewhere in between. The Pope was above all a pragmatic diplomat who put the interests of the Church above moral principles. Individual Catholics and priests showed heroism in saving Jews and other victims of Nazism. But the Vatican's official position remained passive. The Church did not use its moral authority to condemn the Holocaust while it was happening. Pope Pius XII's silence became one of the most painful issues in the history of the Catholic Church. After the war, the Vatican tried to portray itself as a victim of Nazism and a defender of the persecuted. But archival documents paint a more complex and unpleasant picture. What happened to the Nazis after the fall of the Reich? After the fall of the Third Reich, thousands of Nazi criminals fled Germany to escape justice. Many of them used secret routes that historians call rat trails. These routes led through Italy to South America, the Middle East, and other hideouts. The Vatican and associated Catholic organizations played a key role in organizing these escapes. The center of the operation was Rome, where there were numerous monasteries and church institutions. Austrian Bishop Alois Hudal headed an informal network of assistance to fugitive Nazis. He believed that he was saving anti-communists who would be needed in the future struggle against the Soviet Union. Hudal used his connections in the Vatican to obtain forged documents and visas. Croatian priest Krsto Draganović organized an entire system for smuggling war criminals. He worked closely with American intelligence agencies, which used some Nazis as agents in the Cold War. Draganović helped dozens of high-ranking SS and Ustasha members escape. The mechanism worked as follows. The fugitives arrived in Rome with forged documents, or by secretly crossing the border. They were hidden in monasteries, especially in the monastery of Santa Maria dell'Anima, which was supervised by Bishop Hudal. There, they were issued new documents in the names of refugees from Eastern Europe. The Vatican Commission for Refugee Assistance, headed by Monsignor Giovanni Battista Montini, the future Pope Paul VI, issued Red Cross travel documents. These documents did not require thorough identity checks and were recognized by all countries. With them, Nazi criminals could travel freely. The Italian authorities turned a blind eye to this activity, receiving bribes from the fugitives and their patrons. The ports of Genoa and Naples became the main departure points. From there, ships took the Nazis to Argentina, Chile, Brazil, and other Latin American countries. Argentine President Juan Perón actively invited German specialists, without asking questions about their past. Among the fugitives were the most notorious war criminals. Adolf Eichmann, one of the main organizers of the Holocaust, obtained a Vatican passport under the name of Riccardo Clement and made his way to Argentina. Josef Mengele, the infamous doctor of Auschwitz, also took advantage of the rat trail. Franz Stangl, commandant of the Treblinka death camp, fled via Rome to Brazil. Klaus Barbie, a Gestapo officer nicknamed the Butcher of Lyon, was granted asylum in Bolivia. All of them had documents issued with the help of Catholic organizations. The operation was financed from various sources. The Nazis brought looted gold and jewels. American intelligence agencies paid for the cooperation of some fugitives. Catholic organizations received donations from German businessmen interested in saving their former partners. The Vatican Bank provided currency conversion and money transfers. Officially, the Vatican has always denied any organized involvement in the escape of Nazis. The Church claimed that individual priests may have helped refugees out of humanitarian considerations, unaware of their criminal past. But archival documents testify to the systematic nature of the operation. Too many high-ranking church officials were involved in this activity. Some historians believe that Pope Pius XII knew about the rat lines and tacitly approved of them. The Vatican saw former Nazis as allies in the fight against communism. The Church feared that the trials of war criminals would strengthen the position of leftist forces in Europe. The rat lines operated until the mid-1950s, when they were exposed by journalists and intelligence agencies. By that time, however, most of the fugitives had already settled in their new countries. But the Vatican's financial ties to the criminal world did not end there. The Institute for Religious Works, better known as the Vatican Bank, was founded in 1942 by Pope Pius XII. Officially, its purpose was to manage the Church's funds and finance religious activities. In practice, it became one of the most opaque financial institutions in the world, linked to money laundering, corruption, and organized crime. The bank operates under special rules that are not available to ordinary financial institutions. It is not subject to international banking regulations and is not required to disclose information about its operations. The secrecy of its operations is protected not only by banking secrecy, but also by the diplomatic immunity of the Vatican as a sovereign state. Only religious organizations and high-ranking church officials can open accounts with the bank, but money from a wide variety of clients passes through them. In the 1950s and 1960s, the Vatican Bank actively collaborated with Italian financier Michele Sindona. This man had close ties to the Sicilian mafia and laundered money from drug trafficking and other crimes. Sindona managed several banks that served as a conduit between the Vatican and the criminal world. Pope Paul VI called Sindona the savior of the Vatican for his financial services. Sindona helped the Church move capital out of Italy when the government tried to tax church property. The money was transferred through a complex network of offshore companies in Switzerland, Liechtenstein, and Panama. In the 1970s, Roberto Calvi, president of Banco Ambrosiano, became the Vatican's main partner. He was called the Banker of God because of his close ties to church circles. Calvi created a pyramid of shell companies in tax havens, through which billions of dollars were laundered. The Vatican Bank was the main shareholder in this empire. Archbishop Paul Marcinus, an American of Lithuanian descent, headed the Vatican Bank from 1969 to 1989. This tall, sturdy priest looked more like a Chicago gangster than a church official. Marcinkus had a reputation as a tough businessman, ready to make any deal for profit. He personally approved questionable transactions and covered up the criminal activities of his partners. Money from arms dealing, drugs, and corruption passed through the Vatican Bank. The Propaganda II Masonic Lodge used the bank to finance secret operations by Italian intelligence agencies. Latin American dictators kept their looted funds in accounts opened through religious organizations. Mafia families laundered the proceeds of their criminal activities. In 1982, Calvi's empire collapsed, leaving a debt of $1.3 billion. The Vatican Bank was the main shareholder of Ambrosiano, but refused to accept responsibility for the bankruptcy. On June 18th of that year, Roberto Calvi was found hanged under Blackfriars Bridge in London. Officially, it was ruled a suicide, but all the evidence pointed to murder. Bricks and stones were found in his pockets, and his bag of documents was missing. Before his death, Calvi said he feared for his life and knew too much about the Vatican's secret operations. He threatened to reveal the Church's ties to the mafia and secret services if he was not protected. Archbishop Marcinkus refused to testify to Italian investigators, hiding behind the Vatican's diplomatic immunity. Pope John Paul II defended his banker despite the scandal. Only after international pressure did the Vatican agree to pay $250 million to Ambrosiano's creditors without admitting guilt. What other secret operations is the Holy See hiding? Operation Gladio is one of the most secretive programs of the Cold War. in which the Vatican played an important, albeit carefully concealed role. After World War II, NATO and the CIA created a network of secret armies throughout Western Europe, officially intended to resist a Soviet invasion. In Italy, this network was called Gladio, which means sword. But the real goals of the operation turned out to be much more sinister. Gladio was not engaged in preparing for defense, but in terrorist acts against its own population. This strategy was called tension, and its goal was to create chaos, blame it on leftist forces, and justify strengthening the state's repressive apparatus. From the end of 1948 to the early 1980s, Italy experienced a series of mysterious terrorist attacks, murders, and provocations. Explosions in Piazza Fontana in Milan in 1969, at the train station in Bologna in 1980, and the assassination of Prime Minister Aldo Moro in 1978. All these crimes are linked to the activities of Gladio and its allies. The Vatican's connection to this operation was carried out through several channels. First, Catholic organizations provided infrastructure for the secret network. Monasteries served as weapons depots and shelters for agents. Priests transmitted encrypted messages and gathered intelligence. Church financial structures provided funding for the operations. Second, the Vatican actively supported right-wing parties and anti-communist movements in Italy. The Church mobilized Catholics to vote against the left in elections. Pope Pius XII publicly declared that Catholics who voted for communists would be excommunicated from the Church. This position justified any methods of fighting the left, including terrorism. The Propaganda II Masonic Lodge became the main coordination center for Operation Gladio in Italy. It was headed by Licio Gelli, a man with a dark past who was connected to the fascists, the CIA, and the Vatican. Propaganda II included generals, ministers, judges, journalists, and high-ranking church officials. Archbishop Marcinkus was on the list of lodge members, although the Vatican officially prohibits Catholics from joining the Freemasons. Through the Vatican Bank, Propaganda II financed terrorist groups of both the right and left. The goal was to create maximum chaos and fear in society. The government was to be given a reason to declare a state of emergency and establish an authoritarian regime. The CIA paid the Vatican for its support of anti-communist activities in Italy and other European countries. According to some estimates, the amount was tens of millions of dollars annually. The money went through the Vatican Bank and was distributed among right-wing parties, trade unions, and militant groups. The Americans viewed the Church as a key ally in the fight against the spread of communism. The Vatican used its global network to coordinate similar operations around the world. In Latin America, the Church supported military juntas that fought left-wing rebels. In Eastern Europe, Catholic structures engaged in anti-Soviet propaganda and support for dissidents. In the Middle East, the Church collaborated with Western intelligence agencies to counter Islamic and socialist movements. When Gladio's existence was officially recognized by the Italian government in 1991, parliamentary investigations began. It turned out that NATO's secret armies had been active in 14 European countries, but the whole truth was never revealed. Most of the documents remained classified, and the main organizers escaped punishment. The Vatican's role in Operation Gladio has still not been officially recognized by the Church. The Holy See denies any involvement in terrorism and claims that it acted exclusively in the spiritual sphere. However, the testimonies of participants, declassified documents, and journalistic investigations paint a very different picture. The Church was a full participant in the secret war against communism, ready to use any means necessary to achieve its goals. But what was the Vatican doing in Latin America? 20th century Latin America became an arena of fierce confrontation between left-wing movements and right-wing dictatorships supported by the United States. The Catholic Church, which had enormous influence in the region, found itself at the center of the political struggle. The Vatican's official position almost always leaned in favor of military regimes, despite their brutality and massive human rights violations. The Church saw dictators as defenders against the communist threat and the secularization of society. In Argentina, the military junta that came to power as a result of the 1976 coup unleashed a reign of terror against left-wing activists, trade unionists, and intellectuals. The period from 1976 to 1983 is known as the Dirty War, during which 30,000 people disappeared. They were kidnapped, tortured, and killed without trial or investigation. The bodies were dumped into the ocean from helicopters or buried in unmarked graves. The Catholic Church in Argentina not only remained silent about these crimes, but also actively collaborated with the junta. The military episcopate blessed the actions of the army, calling them a struggle for Christian values. Priests were present in secret prisons, where they gave communion to the executioners before the torture. Some clergy even participated in interrogations and helped remove children from arrested women. Babies born in prison were given up for adoption to military and police families. The Church issued false documents, concealing the children's true origins. These crimes were systematic and sanctioned by the highest church leadership. The Archbishop of Buenos Aires, Cardinal Antonio Carraro, met regularly with the junta leaders and assured them of the Church's support. The papal nuncio to Argentina, Pio Laghi, knew about the atrocities being committed, but chose not to intervene. When relatives of the disappeared turned to the Church for help, they were asked to pray and not make a fuss. The mothers of the Plaza de Mayo, who gathered every Thursday to demand that their children be found, received no support from the Church authorities. In Chile, General Augusto Pinochet seized power in 1973 in a bloody coup that killed democratically elected President Salvador Allende. The new regime launched a massive crackdown on leftist forces. The National Stadium in Santiago was turned into a concentration camp, where thousands of prisoners were held. Pinochet created the DINA secret police, which was responsible for the abduction, torture, and murder of opposition figures. The Catholic Church in Chile took a dual position. On the one hand, Cardinal Raúl Silva Henríquez created the Vicariate of Solidarity, which helped victims of repression and documented human rights violations. It was an important and courageous initiative that saved many lives. On the other hand, the official Vatican continued to support Pinochet, seeing him as a guarantor against the spread of communism. During his visit to Chile in 1987, Pope John Paul II appeared publicly on the balcony with the dictator, which was perceived as an endorsement of the regime. In Brazil, a military dictatorship ruled from 1964 to 1985. The regime systematically used torture, extrajudicial executions, and kidnappings. The Catholic hierarchy largely supported the military, considering them defenders of order and traditional values. However, a powerful liberation theology movement emerged in Brazil, calling on the Church to defend the poor and oppressed. Priests and monks worked in the favelas, supported peasant movements, and criticized social injustice. The Vatican harshly suppressed liberation theology, considering it a manifestation of Marxism in the Church. Cardinal Joseph Ratzinger, the future Pope Benedict XVI, led the campaign against this movement. Priests who preached the ideas of liberation were defrocked, banned from publishing, and expelled from their orders. What was Pope Pius XII's role in these events? Pope Pius XII, elected in 1939, ruled the Catholic Church during the most dramatic period of the 20th century. His pontificate coincided with World War II, the Holocaust, and the beginning of the Cold War. The question of his role in these events remains one of the most controversial in the history of the Church. Critics call him a silent accomplice to Nazi crimes, while defenders claim that he secretly saved Jews and chose diplomacy over open confrontation. The truth is probably more complex than either version. Eugenio Pacelli, as the future pope was known before his election, spent 12 years in Germany as papal nuncio. He was well versed in German culture, spoke the language fluently, and had extensive connections among the German elite. It was he who negotiated the concordat with the Nazi regime in 1933, when he was still Vatican Secretary of State. This experience shaped his conviction that a diplomatic approach was necessary to any problem. From the very beginning of the war, the Vatican received detailed information about Nazi crimes. Polish bishops reported mass shootings of civilians. German priests secretly passed on information about death camps. The Slovak president, Catholic priest Józef Tiso, personally participated in the deportation of Jews, and the Vatican knew about it. Diplomats from neutral countries reported to the Pope on the scale of the Holocaust. By 1942, Pius XII had a complete picture of the genocide that was taking place. In December of that year, he made a Christmas address in which he vaguely mentioned hundreds of thousands of people who were dying through no fault of their own, solely because of their nationality or race. But he did not specifically mention Jews or Nazis as the perpetrators. This address became a symbol of his policy of evasiveness and silence. Explanations for this behavior vary. Some historians believe that the Pope was afraid of provoking even greater repression against the Church and Jews in the occupied countries. In 1942, Dutch bishops publicly condemned the deportation of Jews, after which the Nazis retaliated by arresting and sending all Catholics of Jewish origin to camps, including the nun Edith Stein, who was later canonized. This incident allegedly convinced Pius of the futility of public protests. Other researchers point to Pacelli's personal anti-Semitism, which was characteristic of the church elite of the time. Although he condemned Nazi racial theories, traditional Catholic anti-Judaism was part of his worldview. The Church taught that Jews were responsible for the crucifixion of Christ and were spiritually misguided. These prejudices may have dulled his sense of urgency in saving Jews. A third version emphasizes geopolitical calculations. Pius XII saw communism, not Nazism, as the main threat. He hoped that Germany and the Western Allies would unite against the Soviet Union after the war. Open condemnation of Hitler could have ruined these plans and alienated German Catholics. The Pope preferred to remain neutral, so that the Vatican could act as a mediator in a future peace settlement. As for specific actions to save Jews, the picture is mixed. Some Catholic organizations, monasteries, and priests did hide Jews and help them escape. In Rome, right under the Vatican's windows, churches and monasteries saved about 5,000 Jews. But this was done mainly on the initiative of individuals, not on the direct orders of the Pope. Official Vatican documents contain no orders for systematic assistance to Jews. When the Nazis began deporting Roman Jews in October 1943, the Pope did not issue a public protest. The German ambassador reported to Berlin that the Vatican was not creating problems with regard to the Jewish question. It was only after the war that Pius XII began to actively shape the image of a pope who had secretly fought against Nazism. But why was the criminal Calvi found dead? The murder of Roberto Calvi remains one of the most mysterious criminal stories associated with the Vatican. On June 18, 1982, the body of the 62-year-old banker was found hanging under Blackfriars Bridge in London. The official investigation initially concluded that it was suicide, but there were too many indications that it was murder, carefully staged to look like suicide. Bricks weighing a total of about 5 kilograms and $12,000 in cash, in various currencies, were found in Calvi's pockets. His briefcase with important documents had disappeared without a trace. An examination showed that the knot on the rope had been tied professionally, unlike those usually made by suicides. There were no signs of a struggle on the body, but there were also no traces of him climbing onto the scaffolding under the bridge himself. The events leading up to Calvi's death make the suicide theory even more dubious. A week before his death, he secretly left Italy on a fake passport, fearing arrest. His bank, Ambrosiano, collapsed, leaving a huge debt that creditors were demanding be paid. The Italian authorities brought charges of fraud and money laundering. Calvi knew too much about the financial schemes linking the Vatican, the mafia, the P2 Masonic Lodge, and politicians. Before leaving Italy, Calvi sent a letter to Pope John Paul II, begging for protection and help. He wrote that he had always served the Church faithfully and now expected gratitude. The letter remained unanswered. Archbishop Marcinkus, head of the Vatican Bank and Calvi's main partner in dubious deals, declined to comment on the situation. Calvi's daughter Anna has always claimed that her father was murdered on someone's orders. She conducted her own investigation, gathering a wealth of evidence about the banker's links to the criminal world. According to her version of events, Calvi threatened to reveal secrets about the financing of illegal operations through the Vatican Bank. This sealed his death sentence. Among those who could have been interested in Calvi's death are the Sicilian Mafia, the P2 Masonic Lodge, the Italian Secret Services, and the Vatican itself. The Mafia lost huge sums of money when Ambrosiano went bankrupt and could have taken revenge for this. P2 feared exposure of its secret operations. The Secret Services wanted to hide their links to international terrorism. The Vatican sought to protect its reputation and avoid financial liability. In 2002, the British authorities reopened the investigation, classifying the death as murder. In 2005, the Italian prosecutor's office brought charges against 5 suspects, including the notorious mafioso Giuseppe Callo, nicknamed the Watchman. The prosecution claimed that the murder was ordered by the mafia in retaliation for lost money. However, in 2007, all suspects were acquitted due to lack of evidence. The case remains technically open, but the real culprits have never been found. In parallel with the investigation into Calvi's murder, the authorities attempted to untangle the financial web he had woven together with the Vatican. It turned out that the Ambrosiano Bank was used to launder money from drug trafficking, finance right-wing terrorist groups, and support Latin American dictatorships. The Vatican Bank was the main shareholder and de facto controller of this empire. The Holy See long refused to acknowledge responsibility, citing the fact that it did not personally manage Ambrosiano's operations. Only after enormous international pressure in 1984 did the Vatican agree to pay $250 million to creditors without admitting legal guilt. This amount was only a small fraction of the actual debt. Archbishop Marcinkus never appeared in court. What other secrets do the walls of the Vatican hide? The connection between the Vatican and Freemasonry is one of the most controversial and carefully concealed aspects of church history. Officially, the Catholic Church forbids its members from joining Masonic lodges under threat of excommunication. This position is enshrined in canon law and has been repeatedly confirmed by popes. However, the reality is much more complex than the official doctrine. Freemasonry and Catholicism have a long history of mutual hostility. Freemasons advocated for the secularization of society, freedom of conscience, and the separation of church and state. The church saw them as its main enemies, destroyers of the traditional order, and spreaders of dangerous liberal ideas. The popes of the 18th and 19th centuries issued bulls condemning Freemasonry and forbidding Catholics from having any contact with lodges. But in the 20th century, the situation changed. A common enemy in the form of communism forced Catholics and Freemasons to seek common ground. In Italy, where both the Church and Freemasonry were extremely influential, secret contacts began between the hierarchies of both organizations. The main center of this cooperation was the Propaganda II Lodge. P2 was created in 1945 as a regular Masonic lodge, but by the 1970s, it had become the secret government of Italy. It was headed by Licio Gelli, a former fascist with ties to both Italian and American intelligence agencies, the Mafia, and the Vatican. A list of lodge members discovered during a search in 1981 included nearly 1,000 people. Among them were 3 ministers, 43 members of parliament, 43 generals, judges, police prefects, heads of special services, bankers, and industrialists. It was a real parallel power structure, operating in the shadow of the official state. The list also included the names of high-ranking church officials. Archbishop Paul Marcinkus, head of the Vatican Bank, was closely associated with P2 and participated in its financial operations. Several cardinals and bishops also appeared in the lodge's documents, although the Vatican has always denied their Masonic affiliation. P2 served as a coordination mechanism between the Vatican, the government, the secret services, and criminal structures. Through this network, covert operations were financed, provocations were organized, and undesirable people were eliminated. The Vatican Bank was the lodge's main financial channel. Money flowed between church accounts and P2 members' accounts, blurring the lines between religious and criminal finances. Roberto Calvi was one of the lodge's key financiers. His Ambrosiano Bank served as a conduit between the Vatican and P2. When the system collapsed, Calvi threatened to reveal all the connections. It cost him his life. Within the Vatican itself, there was a faction that sympathized with Freemasonry and its goals. These clerics believed that the Church should modernize and embrace the principles of liberalism. They supported the reforms of the Second Vatican Council and advocated dialogue with the modern world. Their traditionalist opponents accused them of a Masonic conspiracy to destroy the Church from within. The theory of Masonic infiltration of the Vatican was given new life after the strange circumstances surrounding the death of Pope John Paul I in 1978. Albino Luciani became Pope on September 9th and died suddenly on the night of September 28th, after only 33 days on the throne. The official cause of death was a heart attack, but no autopsy was performed, and the circumstances of his death were highly suspicious. Before his death, Pope John Paul I was preparing a radical purge of the Vatican. He planned to dismiss Archbishop Marcinkus, sever ties with dubious financiers, and investigate the activities of the Vatican Bank. He had a list of church officials suspected of having ties to the P2, and he was going to deal with them. These plans could have sealed his death sentence. Does the modern Vatican continue to influence world politics? In the 21st century, the Vatican continues to play a significant role in world politics, although its methods of influence have become more sophisticated and less visible. The Holy See maintains diplomatic relations with 180 countries and has permanent observers at the UN and other international organizations. The Catholic Church has 1.3 billion followers worldwide, giving it unique leverage over political processes. The Vatican's financial power remains impressive, despite the scandals of recent decades. The Vatican Bank manages assets worth about $8 billion. But this is only the visible part of the Church's wealth. With real estate around the world, investments in corporations, and shares in banks and insurance companies, the real value of the Church's empire is estimated at tens of billions. These funds are used not only for religious purposes, but also for political lobbying. The Vatican actively influences legislation in various countries on issues such as abortion, same-sex marriage, euthanasia, and bioethics. Through Catholic organizations and Catholic politicians, the Church promotes a conservative agenda on social issues. This influence is particularly noticeable in Europe and Latin America. Catholic parties and movements receive financial and organizational support from church structures. After the end of the Cold War, the Vatican played an important role in the eastward expansion of NATO and the integration of former socialist countries into Western structures. Pope John Paul II, a Pole by birth, actively supported the Solidarity movement in Poland, which contributed to the fall of the communist regime. The Church helped finance the opposition, transmit information, and coordinate the actions of anti-communist forces. In modern Russia, relations between the Vatican and the Kremlin remain complex. The Catholic Church seeks to expand its influence in the post-Soviet space, which is met with resistance from the Russian Orthodox Church. The Vatican supports Greek Catholic communities in Ukraine, which creates additional points of tension in the region. In the Middle East, the Vatican seeks to protect the interests of Christian minorities and influence conflict resolution. Papal nuncios are actively involved in behind-the-scenes negotiations between warring parties. The Church maintains contacts with various political forces, from moderate to radical, in an attempt to find common ground. In Africa, the Catholic Church is one of the largest providers of educational and medical services. This gives it enormous influence over the formation of elites and public opinion. The Vatican uses this influence to promote its agenda on social and political issues. African bishops often oppose liberal reforms in the field of human rights, relying on traditional values. Financial scandals continue to plague the Vatican in the new century. In 2012, Papal butler Paolo Gabriele stole and leaked thousands of confidential documents to journalists, exposing corruption and intrigue within the church hierarchy. The scandal, dubbed VatiLeaks, showed that problems with transparency and accountability had not gone away. Pope Francis, elected in 2013, promised to reform the Vatican's financial system and make it more transparent. Some changes were made, and international experts were brought in to conduct audits. The Vatican Bank closed thousands of suspicious accounts and introduced new anti-money laundering rules. However, critics argue that the reforms are cosmetic and do not address the core issues. In 2018, Italian police raided the Vatican Bank's offices as part of an investigation into financial fraud. The charges included money laundering, fraud, and abuse of office. Several high-ranking church officials were arrested. The case showed that the old schemes continue to operate, despite promises of reform. But who is trying to uncover these secrets today? Despite the walls of secrecy and diplomatic immunity, the truth about the Vatican's secret affairs is gradually coming to light thanks to the efforts of investigative journalists, historians, and insiders. These people risk their careers, reputations, and sometimes their lives to expose what the Church prefers to keep in the shadows. Italian journalist Carlo Bonini and his colleagues at the newspaper La Repubblica conducted a multi-year investigation into the Vatican's financial machinations. They published a series of articles based on leaked documents and insider testimony. Their work led to criminal cases being brought against high-ranking church officials. For this, the journalists received threats and were subjected to pressure from church authorities. Gianluigi Nuzzi, author of the books His Holiness and Greed, published thousands of secret Vatican documents obtained from papal butler Paolo Gabriele. The documents revealed corruption, intrigue, and power struggles within the highest echelons of the church. Nuzzi was accused of receiving stolen documents, but the court acquitted him, recognizing that the public interest outweighed the interests of protecting secrecy. Emiliano Fittipaldi and Francesco Antonio Gigi published two more scandalous investigations into Vatican finances in 2015. Their books contained compromising information about the extravagance and corruption of church officials. Both journalists were arrested on charges of stealing documents, but were later released under international pressure. American historian John Cornwell wrote the book Hitler's Pope, a critical study of Pius XII's role during the Holocaust. Although some of his conclusions are disputed, the work prompted the Vatican to open part of its World War II archives to independent researchers. However, access remains limited, and the most compromising documents are still classified. British journalist David Yarop investigated the rat lines and the Vatican's role in the escape of Nazi criminals. His book, The Rat Line, is based on declassified U.S. intelligence documents and eyewitness accounts. The work caused a scandal and forced the Vatican to admit that some priests did indeed help the Nazis, although the Church continues to deny that this assistance was systematic. Italian journalist Carmen Lamarca has dedicated her life to investigating the Vatican's links to organized crime. Her articles on the Vatican Bank, the mafia, and P2 helped reveal the scale of criminal schemes. Lamarca received threats of violence from the mafia and pressure from church authorities, but she continued her work. Several priests and church officials became informants, passing secret documents to journalists. Their motives varied, from a desire to cleanse the church of corruption to personal revenge. Paolo Gabriele, the papal butler, explained his actions as a desire to help Pope Benedict XVI see the real state of affairs in the Vatican. Francesco Zanini, a former Vatican financial advisor, revealed tax evasion and money laundering schemes. Historians have access to the Vatican archives, but under strict control. Documents are released selectively, and much material remains inaccessible under the pretext of protecting personal information or the interests of the Church. The archives from the period after 1930 are largely closed. Pope Francis announced the opening of the archives of the pontificate of Pius XII, but researchers complain about restrictions and censorship. International organizations, such as Reporters Without Borders and the International Consortium of Investigative Journalists, support efforts to uncover the Vatican's secrets. They provide legal protection for journalists and funding for investigations. Thanks to their efforts, the public is learning the truth about the Church's secret affairs. Technology is also helping in the fight for transparency. Document leaks now occur in digital format, making it difficult to destroy them completely. But is there any hope of learning the whole truth? The question of the future of Vatican secrets remains open, and is the subject of heated debate among historians, journalists, and social activists. On the one hand, pressure on the Holy See is growing. The scandals of recent decades have seriously undermined the authority of the Church, especially in developed countries. More and more Catholics are demanding transparency and accountability from their spiritual leaders. Secular authorities are tightening control over the Vatican's financial operations, demanding compliance with international anti-money laundering regulations. On the other hand, the Vatican has powerful tools at its disposal to resist. Diplomatic immunity protects the Church from most forms of external pressure. Financial resources allow it to hire the best lawyers and public relations specialists. A global network of believers provides political support in many countries. The Vatican bureaucracy has perfected the art of secrecy and survival over centuries. The digital age creates new challenges for keeping secrets. Document leaks have become widespread and more difficult to control. Papal butler Gabriele was able to copy thousands of documents simply by using a portable scanner. Modern insiders can transfer gigabytes of information to journalists at the touch of a button. Encryption and anonymous networks make it difficult to trace the sources of leaks, but digital technology works both ways. The Vatican is investing in cybersecurity and information access control systems. Modern archives are being digitized, which makes it easier to control who has access to what. The authorization and monitoring system is becoming more sophisticated. Every document view is logged. Every copy is tracked. Pope Francis promised an era of transparency, but real change remains limited. Yes, some reforms of the financial system have been carried out. Yes, some of the archives have been open to researchers. But the fundamental culture of secrecy has not changed. Critically important documents remain inaccessible. Financial transactions are still opaque. Links with politicians and businessmen are hidden from the public. Some experts predict that full disclosure of the Vatican's secrets is impossible without fundamental changes in the structure of the Church. As long as there is a centralized hierarchy with the Pope's absolute authority, mechanisms of control and accountability will remain weak. Secrecy is built into the very nature of an institution that claims divine authority and considers itself above human laws. Others believe that pressure from below and technological progress will inevitably lead to greater openness. New generations of Catholics, who have grown up in the age of the internet and social media, demand transparency from all institutions, including the Church. Scandals involving sexual abuse by priests have shown that secrecy protects criminals and causes enormous damage to victims and the Church as a whole. Perhaps the future will bring a compromise. The Vatican will open part of its archives, especially those relating to long-past events, when all those involved are already dead. Modern financial transactions will become more transparent under pressure from international regulators. But the most sensitive materials, those concerning ties to politicians, intelligence agencies, and criminal organizations, will remain hidden for many decades to come. Future historians may gain access to the full truth about the Vatican's affairs in the 20th century. But the events of the 21st century will most likely remain classified until the end of the lives of those involved. The Church has learned to balance the need for a modern image with the protection of its interests. Each disclosure is carefully measured and controlled. The ultimate truth about the extent of the Vatican's influence on world politics will probably remain a mystery to our contemporaries. But every new investigation, every leak, every brave insider brings us closer to understanding how one of the oldest and most powerful institutions in the world really works. And this understanding changes our view of the history and politics of the last century. What does the future hold? Over 2 millennia of existence, the Catholic Church has survived countless crises, schisms, and scandals. It survived the fall of the Roman Empire, barbarian invasions, the Reformation, the Scientific Revolution, and the Enlightenment. Each time, critics predicted the imminent demise of the Church. But the Vatican not only survived, but also found ways to adapt to the new reality. This ability to transform while maintaining its basic power structure makes the Holy See a unique institution in world history. The key to the Vatican's survival is flexibility in tactics while maintaining strategic goals. The Church may abandon specific allies, acknowledge individual mistakes, and carry out cosmetic reforms, but it never compromises the fundamental foundations of its power. A centralized hierarchy, control over doctrine, financial independence, and diplomatic immunity. In the coming decades, the Vatican will face serious challenges. Secularization continues to gain momentum in Europe and North America. The number of practicing Catholics is declining in traditionally religious countries. Young people are less and less interested in institutional religion. Sexual abuse scandals have dealt a huge blow to the Church's authority. Financial fraud undermines the moral authority on which the Vatican's power is based. But at the same time, the Church is growing in Africa, Asia, and parts of Latin America. The center of Catholicism is shifting from Europe to the global South, where religiosity remains high. This gives the Vatican new sources of growth and influence. African and Asian Catholics tend to be more conservative on social issues, which strengthens the traditionalist wing of the Church. The election of a pope from Latin America, Francis, has become a symbol of this shift. Although the Argentine pontiff positions himself as a reformer, his stance on many issues remains conservative. He criticizes capitalism and inequality, but does not change the Church's teachings on abortion, contraception, and homosexuality. This balancing act between tradition and modernization is typical of Vatican policy. The technological revolution provides the Church with new tools for evangelization and control. The Vatican actively uses social networks, streaming platforms, and digital media to spread its message. Pope Francis has millions of followers on Twitter and Instagram, but the same technology makes secrets more vulnerable to exposure. The geopolitical situation creates both dangers and opportunities. The conflict between the US and China is forcing the Vatican to maneuver between the two superpowers. The Church is seeking to improve relations with Beijing in order to protect Catholics in China and gain access to a huge market. But this is causing friction with Washington and criticism from human rights advocates. In the Middle East, the Vatican is trying to protect Christian minorities amid growing Islamic radicalism. In Eastern Europe, the Church is fighting Moscow for influence in the post-Soviet space. In Latin America, it is countering the growth of evangelical churches, which are taking followers away from Catholics. The climate crisis gives the Vatican an opportunity to position itself as a moral authority on global issues. Pope Francis has made environmental protection one of the priorities of his pontificate. The encyclical Laudato Si presents ecology as a religious and moral imperative. This allows the Church to remain relevant in an era when traditional religious themes are losing their influence on young people. The future of Vatican secrets depends on the balance of power between reformers and traditionalists within the Church. Each new pope brings his own style of governance, but systemic changes are slow. The Vatican bureaucracy, the Roman Curia, has enormous inertia and resists radical change. Cardinals and bishops, who have made their careers in the old system, have no interest in destroying it. What role will the Church play in shaping the future of humanity? The Vatican's secret documents are much more than just historical artifacts or the subject of conspiracy theories. They are the key to understanding the mechanisms of power that have shaped world history in recent centuries. The Church, which positions itself as a spiritual and moral force, has in fact always been a political player, using any means available to achieve its goals. From concordats with fascist dictators to financial machinations with organized crime. From silence during the Holocaust to support for military juntas in Latin America. The history of the Vatican in the 20th century is full of contradictions between its declared values and its actual actions. These contradictions do not make the Church uniquely evil or corrupt. They show that any institution of power, even one cloaked in religious authority, is subject to the same temptations and vices as secular organizations. The importance of revealing Vatican secrets goes beyond historical curiosity. Understanding how the Church influenced political processes helps explain many events of the past century. Why some dictatorships gained international legitimacy, while others did not. How secret operations by special services were financed. What forces were behind political assassinations and terrorist attacks? The Vatican was not the only player in these processes, but it was an important one. For modern society, the question of Vatican secrets is linked to the issue of institutional accountability. Can an organization that claims moral leadership exist outside the framework of transparency and responsibility? Should diplomatic immunity protect against criminal investigation? These questions are relevant not only to the Church, but also to other international organizations and states. The future will show how far the declassification process will go. Perhaps in 50 or 100 years, historians will have full access to the archives of the 20th century and will be able to write the definitive history of the Vatican's secret influence. Or perhaps the most compromising documents will be destroyed, and the official version of events will remain the only one available. Technology makes the complete destruction of information increasingly difficult, but not impossible. For 1 billion Catholics around the world, these revelations create a moral dilemma. How can they reconcile their faith in the spiritual message of the Church with the knowledge of its earthly sins? Some prefer to separate the institution from the doctrine. Others leave the Church in disappointment, and still others demand reform from within. This tension will determine the development of Catholicism in the coming decades. The Vatican secrets remind us that history is written not only on battlefields and in parliaments, but also in the quiet offices of diplomats, in the underground vaults of banks and archives, and in secret negotiations between those in power. The disclosure of these secrets changes our understanding of the past and influences the present. Every declassified document, every journalistic investigation, every insider testimony adds new details to the picture of how the world of power really works. And this picture turns out to be much more complex and gloomy than the official versions of history. We can only hope that the quest for truth will ultimately prevail over the quest for secrecy, and that future generations will be able to learn from the mistakes of the past by having access to the whole truth.